This is Duke University.
This week on Office Hours. The cost of college is both a public issue for policymakers and a personal issue for students and their families seeking to balance debt and educational opportunity. As Duke's Director of Financial Aid, Alison Rabil's job is to ensure that adequate aid is available to all students who choose to come to the university. I see myself as an advocate and a voice for those who cannot afford the full cost at Duke, Rabil says. Alison Rabil joins us today to take your questions about how to pay for college.
Welcome to Office Hours. I'm Valerie Schwartz from Duke's Admissions Office, and I'm here today with Alison Rabil. Alison, thank you for taking time to hold these online office hours.
Thanks for having me.
And this is really the financial aid season, if you will. This is the time of year when families of current college students and prospective college students are crunching numbers, filling out financial aid forms. So, Alison, tell me, what is it like at this time of year in your office?
Well, we're all gearing up right now. So all of the admission applications are in, and admissions is busy evaluating those applications. And at the same time, the financial aid deadline for Duke is March 1st. So forms have started to come in for the 20,000 or so students who have checked off that they're interested in financial aid. So right now we're just preparing for admissions to let us know who we need to evaluate and trying to answer as many questions as we can about the process for students.
Sure. And perhaps you can just give us an overview and tell us a little bit about the basics of how Duke's financial aid process works. How does your office go about awarding aid? What does it cover? And how is it different from what other institutions do in terms of financial aid?
Okay. Well, every school, every institution will establish a student budget, which is the total cost of education at the institution. So your tuition and your fees, your room, your board, everything we think you're going to need to cover in terms of an expense. And then we use the CSS profile form and the FAFSA form, two of the forms that need to be handed in March, to evaluate the financial health of the family and calculate a family contribution. So from the total cost of education, we take away the family contribution, assuming the family can make the contribution, and we have what's left over, which we call our financial need. And then at Duke, we meet 100% of that need, meaning we try to meet all of that need for each student with a little bit of a loan, a little bit of work study, and the majority of it is grant aid from the institution. So the way that it's a little different at Duke, we cover a few things that other institutions might not cover. We cover 2 summer terms of financial aid, so that if a student wanted to participate in a student government one term and maybe take a little bit less of a load and possibly take a course over the summer, we would cover that summer term. If a student chooses into a single, for example, for housing, we'll actually pay for the cost of housing rather than a general fee for housing, so that students can choose the housing that they qualify for based on what they're most interested, where they're most interested in living, and not where they can afford to live. So there are a few things. We try to make it so that the program covers those things that students are most interested in doing and that Duke wants to promote. So the Duke Engage program has a financial aid component to it. Study abroad has a financial aid component, so students on aid are not prohibited or excluded for any of the programs at Duke.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And Alison, as you know, we have questions coming in right now from online viewers. We've actually had a number of them trickle in already. For those of you who are tuning in, you're welcome to participate in this office hours conversation. You can email your questions to live@duke.edu, or you can tweet in a question using hashtag DukeLive, or you can post to the Duke University Facebook page. So our first viewer question comes from Sandy. This is via Facebook. She says, as a parent of a child considering an early decision application next year, I'm concerned about how binding the commitment is in the event the financial aid or scholarship package doesn't meet the family's needs. Since the financial aspect isn't settled until months after early decision notification, what are their options? That sort of thing. Okay.
So early decision at Duke was I think the deadline was November 15th, and then we gave financial aid decisions by the beginning of December or the middle of December. So the fact is that we were actually able to give financial aid decisions before students actually had to entirely commit. You're committed to early decision, and the reason to apply for early decision is because that is the one school that you're really most interested in going to. So that's the first thing, is make the right decision about early decision, not because of finances, but because of the school that you're really most interested in attending. And if Duke is that school, and you hand in the financial information that we've asked you for, we will give you a decision by December 15th. So if there is a situation where our financial aid decision doesn't match what a parent thinks or can manage, we will first have a very long discussion about why that is the case and what we might be able to do, or what information the parent has that maybe we don't have that might change our financial aid decision. And if there is nothing that we can do, which is rare, then we will ask admissions to release a student from that binding agreement before the January 1 deadline to allow them to apply other places. But to be fair, I think that has happened for really only a handful of students. I mean, less than 4 or 5.
Right.
You know, in a 1-year period. It's really fairly rare that we can't figure out what the situation is and why a parent is in a situation where they might not be able to make that contribution that we expected.
Right, and we do get a lot of those questions in admissions as well, so that's
Right.
really great to hear. Another question coming in from Facebook, this one comes from Liz, and this one's regarding 529 plans.
Okay.
She says, I have a question regarding the reporting the value of 529 plans. I've been reporting the full value, even though we've dedicated a quarter of the total to each of 4 years of college. So last year we seemed to be penalized for that, getting far less financial aid than expected. Consequently, our daughter's 529 funds will be depleted before her senior year. So how does Duke look at 529 funds, as if they're available for 100% of 1 year, or are they expected to be spread over the course of several years?
Well, 529 plans are great, and we wish every family had them. And it's correct to report the full amount of the 529 that is left. So in the second year after you've spent a part of it, you would only report what's left on the 529, not the original amount. And the financial aid contribution that would be calculated would be based on, in part, on that asset. And so as that asset goes down, the financial aid contribution that's expected from that asset also goes down. So the key to a 529 is we consider it at Duke a parent asset, not a student asset. So that student assets are considered usually in the formula much more, they're taxed much more heavily, for lack of a better way to put it, than parent assets, because we assume that parent assets are meant to cover all kinds of things that parents have to cover for the entire family. Whereas student assets, we're assuming that a large part of those student assets are available to help pay for college as their one large expense in life up to this point. So assuming that the 529 is in the parents' and the student's name, at Duke, we assume that that's a parent asset. And that gives parents a lot more leeway and flexibility in how they choose to spend it. So if they spent the entire 529 in the first year, then the asset would no longer be there. It wouldn't be counted as part of the asset, and that would be the parent choice, but it's not what we would have expected.
Gotcha. So as we're hearing and seeing from these questions alone, you know, the topic of financial aid is one that's very much at the forefront of a lot of families' minds these days. I think that's particularly true in light of the emphasis President Obama placed on affordability of post-secondary education last week in his State of the Union address. I'm sure that you saw it, but perhaps we can have a refresher and just take a look at a little bit of what he said in that speech last week.
Great.
When kids do graduate, the most daunting challenge can be the cost of college. At a time when Americans owe more in tuition debt than credit card debt, this Congress needs to stop the interest rates on student loans from doubling in July.
So can you talk a little bit about that, Alison, as far as the possibility of the student loan doubling in July? I mean, what do you see as happening in terms of Congress's decision, and what do you hope happens?
Well, I mean, the interest rate right now in 2011 is 3.4%. So as of July 1st, it's slated to jump to 6.8%. And I think when the interest rates were set 5 or 6 years ago, the assumption at the time was that they would obviously reset the interest rate and leave it at 3.4%. But nobody anticipated the economic downturn a few years ago. And so all of a sudden we realized, oh my gosh, maybe they actually won't leave the interest rate at 3.4, and there was a real possibility. I mean, it's difficult when the government is in a situation of having to provide funding on the other side for any expenditure that they're going to have, so that if there's loss in interest revenue for the government, they're going to have to make up for that expense somewhere else, and I'm just not sure where that's going to come from. So I'm not optimistic that they're actually going to do it. Would I love them to do it? Yes. I mean, I think it's really critical. It's really, college is a way for students for young people and returning students to really change direction and move on, and it's shown that college is worth it financially for anyone to complete even a few years of. And so to have interest payments and loan payments that prevent you from moving forward in the same way, it really can hamper one's ability to make the most of the educational experience.
Right.
So.
And I guess along the same lines, in another of President Obama's speeches last week, he brought up the idea of having all colleges and universities nationwide put forward a shopping sheet that basically documents the return on investment for that particular school for students who are interested. So what are your thoughts on that? Would a shopping sheet benefit Duke in the sense that it would showcase the value of a Duke degree?
I think it could. I mean, I don't think an institution like Duke that has so much to offer and has so many programs and so many resources, I don't think that it's something that it's something we would probably be very proud of. I mean, that our students do well, they're placed well, they earn well, they're interesting, they go and do amazing things. I think that depending on how that shopping sheet was set up, it wouldn't be a problem. Right. I think where that is difficult is for, say, a community college, where they are providing training for returning students who may not have been in school for the last however many years, and they're really trying to get students back into the flow and back into the economy in a different way. And students come in and out of those programs, stay for a couple courses, stay for an associate's degree, those programs are going to be hard hit by something like that, because it's not to say that just because you took one course but you didn't complete your degree that you didn't benefit from that. So I'm not so sure. But I think community colleges and some of the for-profit institutions are going to probably have more of an issue.
Sure, that makes sense. And back in 2008, the federal government mandated that all colleges and universities needed to post a net price calculator on their websites by, August of 2011?
Right.
And so can you talk a little bit about what information Duke's net price calculator actually provides families, and how accurate is it?
Okay. It's right on our undergraduate financial aid website, so it's supposed to be prominently displayed. So at any school that you're interested in checking out, it should actually be easy to find. So I'm hoping ours is fairly easy to find. And what that's supposed to do is to tell you what your outlay, given your income and your assets, would be if you were admitted to Duke or to any other institution. And so ours is set up so that it hopefully mirrors to a large extent what we do in our office. So the one caveat I would put in there is that self-employed families and business owners do not usually benefit from Duke's net price calculator or anybody else's. The reason being, it's hard to estimate what an income will be from year to year for a business, and it fluctuates so drastically that can be hard for a calculator that is using last year's financial information to calculate next year's income. In this economy, we tend to find that those are the families who call and say, but your net price calculator said, and it's hard to say, but it's not truly meant or set up to be as accurate for those types for incomes that fluctuate drastically from year to year.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have a few questions coming in. These are sort of specific to individual circumstances, but I think would apply, broadly to lots of folks are probably experiencing similar sorts of things.
Okay.
So Evan asks via email, his income has dropped considerably this year. In 2010, he made a substantial income, but normal. In 2011, it ballooned a bit. Just because of severance from a job being eliminated during a restructuring. And it looks like 2012 will be lean as the market's difficult and he may start a business or take a lesser job for a partial year. So his oldest is a high school senior and they'll be making college decisions soon, so the timing is tough. What do you recommend for completing financial aid requests?
Not use the net price calculator. So that would be the first recommendation, because this is one of those situations where the income from year to year to year has really fluctuated a fair amount. So the first thing to understand, at least about Duke, is that we use last year's tax return in order to estimate what next year's aid should be. Right? So our estimate on your aid is only as good as last year's tax returns. And our assumption in financial aid is that last year's income would be the same as this year's income. Mm-hmm. So if it's not the case, and this would be at any school, if your income that you're reporting on the FAFSA and you're reporting on the profile form and you're handing in terms of last year's tax returns is substantially different this year from what it was last year, you need to let the financial aid office know. Mm-hmm. In as much detail as is humanly possible. And I mean financial detail, not what the job situation is and how they fired you and all these things. But what have been the financial ramifications for your family? So what is your take home now? What did you get in severance? What are you expecting in unemployment, if anything? What kind of package did you get when you left? So that the financial aid office can make a decision about whether it's able to use professional judgment to reconstruct a financial aid year based on the information that you've given them, rather than use the prior year's tax return, which is probably not so accurate.
Right. And I guess I'm curious, what would you recommend in terms of how should the families convey that information to you? Through email, through phone calls? Who should they speak with?
Well, if you're applying to lots of different colleges, many colleges use the IDOC financial aid system through the College Board, which to hand in tax returns. And if that is the case, and you're handing in information to the IDOC system, I would hand in a letter and just have it scanned in with all the rest of your financial aid information. Excellent. So that every school that is getting your financial information through IDOC would also get that letter. Then if schools are not using IDOC and they're using an individual system, then I would fax or send or email or smoke signal that letter to that office and make sure that they knew what your situation was. But I think you could craft one good detailed letter and make sure that everybody had it.
Excellent. So Sheila asks, and she sent this via email,
okay.
I have a son graduating from college this year, and we filled out FAFSA every year. It has been time-consuming, and we've not really gotten any benefit from it. So is there a financial cutoff point where it does help families? And in the past, they've made around $110,000 a year, and this year will make around $70,000 due to having only one income. So do you have any suggestions? They do have another child who will be entering college this fall, and she has heard from most folks that FAFSA is beneficial, so she wants to know if they're doing something wrong.
Okay, so they're not doing anything wrong. So there are, at Duke at least, there are two primary forms that we ask families to fill out, the FAFSA form and the CSS profile form. The FAFSA form, it's important to know, only tells us the eligibility for that family for federal aid. So it will only tell us whether that family is eligible for Pell Grants, for Stafford loans, for Perkins loans, for SEOG grants. Right? So it's only for federal aid. So at earning $110,000, most likely the only thing that the family would be eligible for, given the federal cutoffs, would be Stafford loans. Right? So but that is the only thing that the FAFSA form is used for. The CSS profile form many schools use and Duke uses to get more nuanced financial information about a family. So if a family earning $100,000 a year at Duke with one in college from North Carolina came in, most likely they would qualify for some kind of financial aid, but it would be based on the information in the CSS profile form. So if we didn't ever get the profile form, all we would award would be the federal aid, which would be fairly insignificant. It would be a loan, right? Whereas if the the average grant at Duke is a little over $32,000. Right. So So there's, and about half of our student body gets some kind of assistance. So, and I would think, without having won the lottery or without some kind of trust fund somewhere, this family sounds fairly average, so to speak, and would qualify for a significant amount of aid. But the aid would be from Duke,
Right.
wouldn't be from the federal government. So the Pell Grant cutoffs don't include families that are going to earn, $70, $80, $100,000. They're going to include those families who have significantly less in terms of savings or salary.
Sure. Susan asks also via email, her son is a student at East Carolina University. She says his grades are borderline, and so he doesn't qualify for financial aid from the school. She's a single mom, and she's exhausted the amount of credit she can co-sign for in terms of private student loans for him. He's now old enough to qualify as an independent student, so her salary is not considered in applying for a Pell Grant. The FAFSA process says he qualifies for a Pell Grant, which he desperately needs to finish school. However, the school turned him down, saying he does not qualify due to his grades. So do you have any suggestion of where to get financing when the student is trying to finish the last year but doesn't have access to funds?
Okay, so first of all, the Pell Grant has nothing to do with grades. So the Pell Grant is based on, as I mentioned in the last question, the eligibility for a Pell Grant is based solely on income and assets, sometimes assets, but mostly on income, and it's based on the information that's put on the FAFSA form. There's not one question about grades on the FAFSA form. It has nothing to do with that. So as long as you're, the only qualifier there is that the student needs to be making satisfactory academic progress, and there are rules for what the school, what each individual school considers satisfactory academic progress. And if he's not making satisfactory academic progress, then that might be a reason to disqualify him from any aid going forward. But they should have put him on some kind of probation.
Sure.
In which case, he might be able to talk to them about what he would need to do in order to boost the grades enough to qualify as satisfactory and then to qualify for aid. But generally speaking, if you're passing your classes, the Pell Grant is based on your family's income.
Sure.
If beyond that, there are plus loans that could be available to a family. If the student is independent, then that would probably take plus loan eligibility out of range.
Okay.
So, but for dependent students, there are parent loans that are available for students. And if a parent, it's based on credit, but it's not based on income. So if your credit is good and you've stayed current on your bills, doesn't matter if you're not working, you can actually still qualify for the loan, which is a helpful resource for some parents. Also has very flexible repayment options. But beyond that, private loans are going to be the option, and those are based on credit and income. The student, as an independent student, will also qualify for, if they qualify for Pell Grants, would also qualify for Stafford loans.
Right.
So there's a fair amount in loans, loan eligibility that hopefully the student would have in addition to the Pell Grant.
Great. Kind of along the same lines, Stuart asks via email, how much should a student be willing to borrow, and how much should the cost of the education affect the student's choice?
I think that's up to each individual family and what that education and what it costs, and what you feel. Every family's cutoff, so to speak, is different. What they feel like is just way too much. So I don't ever presume to make that decision for a family. I tell families what we can do, what we can't do, what the options are, and let them decide as a family what they can manage.
Sure.
But at Duke, we really try to, we cap our loans at $5,000. So any family who qualifies for financial aid would have a maximum of a $5,000 loan in the package. Per year. So that our average graduating debt is around $20. And a kind of decent rule of thumb, kind of a handy rule of thumb, is about $110 to $120 per every $10,000 you borrow in terms of payment if you're on a standard 10-year repayment plan. Now, you can quote me, but somebody will dispute it. But it's rough. So if you borrowed $20,000, you're probably going to be paying $200 to $250 a month for that $20,000 in loans, which is not insignificant when you're getting out with your first job.
Right.
There are payment plans that help you manage that, so you wouldn't necessarily have to pay that much each year. But that kind of helps guide families and students think about, what can I afford, what can I manage, what am I willing to take on? And then every family has to figure that out for themselves.
Exactly. Anna asks, also via email, for those of us with very young children, what is the best way to start saving for college?
Just do. We have, there are 529 plans, which are great, and they're meant for education, and you need to use them for education, but you can use them for all of your children. So if you saved them for one child and that child ended up not using all of them, you could use them for another child. So just because they're in a 529 plan doesn't mean that it has to be for one particular child, which is nice to know. And those tend to be good savings vehicles. If even just a savings account, if you put things away, if you just take however much you can spare a month and put it away. I would put it, the one piece of advice I would probably say is put it in keep it in the parent's name rather than in the student's name, because as I mentioned a little earlier, the student assets, if it were all student savings, might be considered more available for college than a parent asset would.
Right.
So you could have a joint account with the student and the parent as long as the parent's name is on it. And then if something comes up, the parent can also use that for other expenses. If like in the last 3 years, all things don't go as planned, then you haven't locked yourself into something that you can't get out of and have to pay a huge penalty for. But the important thing is to save. I don't think it's as important which way you go about it. If it's the problem is when families don't have savings, they have very little option other than daily income to pay for college, and that limits what the choices family has in terms of how they pay for something.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the next question is a little bit different. It's asking a little bit more about information sharing. This comes from the College Solution via Facebook.
Okay.
And I would love to know why Duke hasn't posted a more recent common data set on its website. The latest is from 2009-2010. Why is that?
Okay. Common data set is a set of information that tells that calculates what Duke's statistics are, for example, where students, how much our families earn, what our average grants are, what our yields are, those kinds of things. So those statistics are often really interesting to families to help evaluate whether this is a school that a student would like to consider. We have on the Duke Financial Aid website, which I think was right up at the beginning, where that picture came from. If you go to Duke Financial Aid and you go to undergraduate financial aid, there's a tab that says statistics, and that is 2010-2011 statistics, which is the last available group of statistics that we have. There's also statistics on our calculator, so that if any student gets to the calculator and looks at that, we have some basic statistics there. And the provost office, which is what I think this commenter is looking at, has a set of statistics that are up that are university-wide and not just specific to financial aid. And so I think they may just take a little bit longer to compile all of their statistics for every single piece about Duke than we have. But I'm sure that if it isn't up right now, that it will be up fairly soon.
Great.
But 2010, 2011 would be the most recent year of any statistic that's going to be up there.
Sure.
Since 2011-12 is still in flux, we would never put anything up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
This one comes from Bargavi via email, and Bargavi is actually a Duke employee, has been for the past 5 years. She's a single mother, and her son is going to NC State this fall, and she wants to know whether she'll get any financial benefit from Duke regarding this matter, tuition discounts, etc. So she's been here for 5 years.
Okay, so the first thing she should do is go talk to HR.
Right.
So there are tuition benefits for Duke employees, but I think it depends on length of service. It might depend on what job you're in, but I'm less familiar with that.
Right.
But the HR benefits department would be able to tell exactly what would be available, and if it is available, what that translates to in terms of dollar amounts, and which schools she could use it for.
Sure.
So there may be some restriction on, even if she has the tuition benefit, whether it would actually apply to NC State or not, I'm not sure.
Right.
So.
A question for you, just from my own perspective from admissions. So we, like many schools nationwide, Duke has seen a pretty significant increase in applications for admission from international students in recent years. And so can you talk a little bit about how financial aid works differently or similarly for international students than it does for students here in the U.S.?
Sure. For our domestic students or U.S. citizens and permanent residents, we don't consider any achievement in looking at financial aid. So we would never look to see what they've done in their admission application in order to award financial aid. And similarly, you wouldn't look at the financial information to make your admission decision. For international students, it's different. Right. So for it, we are not need blind in terms of our admission policy, which means that the admission department will take a look at whether a student has enough to pay for college or not, and consider those who need financial aid and those who don't need financial aid in two different admission pools. So everybody who checks off that they do need financial aid and is international or a non-U.S. citizen would be considered in a separate pool, and then there are limited scholarships for students who are not U.S. citizens. So I think we've had about 20 a year so far, but we've had our new wonderful Karsh donation this year. So I think that will help increase over time the number of international students we are able to admit with scholarships. So that was really exciting.
Absolutely. Yeah, we were very excited about that. The next question comes from Chris. It's via email, and he'd like to know, what is the best thing the federal government could do to help students going to college short of more money for Pell? So this is your opinion.
Short of?
Right.
Short of. I mean, I think the interest rate wouldn't be a bad thing, if they could keep the interest rate at 3.4 and keep students who had to borrow to go to school, keep that amount at what they borrowed, as close to what they borrowed as, and minimize the amount of interest. That would be huge. That would be really huge. Pell Grants, you can't avoid Pell Grants. I mean, that is the most, it's based on income, and it's the most effective way to get students to understand that they have money to pay for college. It's a very simple system. You fill out a FAFSA form, you're eligible for the Pell, you bring the Pell wherever you go to school. Whatever can be done for Pell, I think, is important in the larger higher educational system. Beyond that, I think I'm not a big proponent of more legislation to regulate financial aid so that it does so it's simplified. For example, I think the more regulation there is, the more confusing it actually gets. Not to say that it shouldn't be regulated, but I'm not so sure that the federal government's best role is regulating the financial aid system to the extent that it has.
Because schools are also different from one another.
They're also different, and the system is so complicated that so many families, as we can see, are very confused about what does what and what does the FAFSA form do and how do I get money and what will it pay for, how am I supposed to afford it, that I think that is one of the things that is not helpful. Now, how they would mitigate that, I'm not exactly sure. But
Right. So this one's, again, a little bit more Duke specific. Liz asks via Facebook, how does Duke factor in rising plane fare costs into their financial aid packages? So she lives on the West Coast, and she says they're being eaten alive by airline ticket prices.
Well, it's kind of funny because we actually just yesterday wrote to our travel agent and said, give us the average economy fare round trip ticket for every state.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's how we do it. And we do it once a year. We do it at a point in time. So if the fares go up in the middle of the year, we're kind of stuck with our estimate from this past summer. So, but what we try to do is include in our total cost of attendance the round trip cost for two sets of plane tickets, 2 round trip tickets. One obviously to go home at Christmas time, hopefully, and one to get home at the end of the year. For international students, we actually budget only 1 round trip ticket. So, but we'll fund them while they're here on campus if they have to stay over the break.
Right.
So, so we do a point in time estimate. So if the prices have gone up then that'll be our point in time estimate of what 2 round fare tickets to, I think we do LA and Sacramento or something, or LA and San Francisco, since the flights are fairly different.
Sure,
yeah.
Place to place. What do you do in terms of, do you encourage students to seek out outside scholarships like the Gates Millennium Scholarship or ROTC scholarships? Do you encourage them to seek outside scholarships? Where is sort of the benefit line in terms of outside scholarships versus those internal to Duke or any institution?
Okay. It's always to a student's benefit to apply for outside scholarships, no matter where you go, even if you come to Duke. So it's always worth it. Now the question is, how does it have an effect on the grant aid that you've already gotten?
Right.
So I like to think of it as a glass. So I'm fairly visual. And so if you look at the glass as the total cost of education, and then you say, okay, that glass would have to be filled up entirely in order for you to be able to come to Duke. Then part of that glass is filled up by the parent contribution, right? Mm-hmm. So the parents contribute what they can, so they fill up that part of the glass. Then there's the student contribution, and they fill up that part of the glass. And then whatever's left over is the need, right? So the school will fill up the rest of it to some extent, or Duke will fill up the rest of it at least. We fill it up with a little bit of loan, we fill it up with a little bit of work study, and the rest of it we fill up with grant aid so that the whole thing is full. Mm-hmm. So if you get an outside grant, think of it that way. If you dump the outside grant into the full glass, it's going to overflow. We're not allowed to have, a student is not allowed by all the different regulations that we have to have more grant aid than the total cost of attendance. So if that glass is the total cost of attendance, and you've now added a couple $1,000s in outside grant aid, but the glass was already full, we've got to take something away. Right, so that makes sense?
Right.
So if we take something away, what are we going to take away? Do we automatically take away Duke grant aid? No. What we take away first are the less desirable pieces that have filled up that glass. So we take away the loan amount first, and then we'll take away the work study. Though at Duke we can add it back in Duke work study, and only after we've eliminated those two would we reduce the Duke grant aid.
Right.
So if you had a $5,000 loan in your package, right, and you had a $2,000 work study job, and you got a $5,000 outside scholarship from a local community organization, mm-hmm. the $5,000 from the community organization would come in, and the $5,000 loan would go out.
Nice.
And so that you would have grant aid. And from Duke, grant aid from an agency and work study, plus your parent contribution that would make up the total cost of attendance.
Excellent.
So it's always to a student's advantage, even if in that situation, if they had $8,000 worth of outside grant aid, mm-hmm. they would have lost the $5,000 loan, the $2,000 in work, and then they would have lost $1,000 worth of the grant from Duke, but they get to keep $8,000 of their grant. So right. In the end, they're going to be better off.
Exactly.
Right. So even if you lose a little bit of it, it's still going to be much to your advantage to have applied for that grant. Absolutely.
That's great. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk recently about the ever-increasing college tuition rates, not just here, but
right.
everywhere. And you were mentioning earlier that, this is sort of a point of year thing where you would look into things like airfare and that sort of thing.
Right.
So at what point in the year is it determined whether an institution will increase its tuition for the following year? Has that conversation been had? What is the future of Duke in terms of increasing tuition rates?
I think the conversation is happening now. Mm-hmm. So and will be settled before we send out our admission letters. Mm-hmm. Sort of around April 1st. But those figures wouldn't be available until that point because they have to be approved by the Board of Trustees. Right. So they're discussing all of that right now. So what do we need? What can we cut? How can we minimize what we're going to do in terms of increases to tuition or housing costs or dining costs? So does food cost more now? Does heating and electricity cost more now? And how are we going to either absorb that extra cost and cut something, or is our only choice to pass that on in terms of an increase in housing costs or in meal plan costs? Mm-hmm. So I think we do a good job in trying to minimize the amount that we increase our tuition. We realize families stretch to make it happen, whether or not they have financial aid. So I think it's important to be not go through the roof, but it's also hard not to increase costs some when the cost of operating an institution as big as this one doesn't stay stable.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess along those lines, in terms of student appreciation for financial aid and all that you do, Duke Student Broadcasting actually had an opportunity to go out and talk with a few students on campus who are recipients of financial aid to find out about their experiences, both just in terms of being on financial aid and also in terms of working with folks in your office. So we can take a look and see what they have to say.
Okay.
If you really have major questions, like your financial aid counselor, if you just make a meeting with them, they can go over everything with you, and everyone seems to really want to help you. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I think that's like not even concerning just financial aid, but just being at Duke, there's so many great resources that I wish I learned more about my freshman year, but I didn't because I chose not to dig around and ask questions. The cost of going to Duke really shouldn't hinder you because Duke Financial Aid is such a great resource, and they are really friendly, and they, at least when I met with them, I really felt like they really cared about my personal situation, was trying to do anything with my best interest in mind.
Another component of financial aid that I found really helpful is work study. A lot of my friends all have campus jobs, and it's perfect because it's convenient. It helps pay for our schooling, and things like textbooks or travel or laundry, all those things are usually covered by my work study. So it's been a very positive experience overall.
So that's great to hear.
It is.
What advice do you give students, either prospective students or current students, if they're not sure what questions to ask with regard to their financial aid packages? What advice would you give them in terms of approaching your staff?
Well, the first thing is that your financial aid advisor is listed on our website. So depending on what the first letter of your last name is, there's a person actually dedicated to your case, and hopefully can keep that for your 4 years here. So has some understanding what your family's financial situation is, and sees your aid package from year to year and is able to manage that. So even just introducing yourself is not a bad thing, sure. So that there's a face associated with the figures or the numbers that we're actually looking at. But if there are any questions, can I get a work study job? The very basic questions are sometimes the best ones to ask. Is there anything that we can do about my parent contribution? We're really struggling with this, or I'm having trouble finding a job. Are there ways, or what kinds of things can I do over the summer that are, for paid resources? Not that the financial aid office does the work of the Career Center, but we obviously work fairly closely with them. So there's a fair number of opportunities that we understand. How can I pay for summer school? How can I pay for study abroad? How does it work? I guess the point is to ask before you eliminate something from consideration. So don't not go on study abroad because you think you can't afford it.
Right.
Right? Because the assumption may be entirely wrong, and then you would have given up that entire opportunity because of some misconception.
Absolutely.
So even if you feel like it's a bit of a silly question, it's worth asking. So how does that work? I really kind of want to go to Paris, and I'm not really sure how to do that. We'll run through the particulars, and the more students understand and parents understand about how it works, the more they can ask questions that pertain to their situation.
Absolutely. Well, Alison, that's really all that we have time for today.
Okay.
So thank you for being here to hold these office hours. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And Alison Rabil is our Director of Financial Aid here at Duke University. If you have questions about Duke's financial aid policies or procedures, as she mentioned a couple of times, please visit their website. It's finaid.duke.edu. And this conversation will be recorded. It's going to be posted along with many other Duke videos on the Duke On Demand website, which is ondemand.duke.edu.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.